At 2:13 a.m., the emergency room doors burst open and a 200-pound military working dog hit the floor in a spray of blood. The handler behind him was barely standing, one arm pressed to a wound in his side, uniform soaked black. Every head in that ER snapped toward the chaos, and every doctor froze. The animal's chest was barely moving. The soldier's lips were turning gray. In the back of the room, behind a supply cart, a quiet nurse in worn-out scrubs looked up from her charting and felt something shift in her gut. She hadn't felt in 7 years, something that used to keep her alive. If this story already has you on the edge of your seat, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. Maya Whitmore had been awake for 19 straight hours when the night finally broke open. She'd started her shift the way she always did, early, quiet, before the day nurses cleared out and the overnight chaos began. Harbor Ridge Military Medical Center sat at the edge of the port city of Caldwell, a mid-sized facility that served both civilian emergencies and the military installation 8 miles east. It was supposed to be a prestige posting. The brochure called it a center of excellence. The people who worked there mostly called it a pressure cooker with fluorescent lighting. Maya had been there 11 months, long enough to learn where the good coffee was hidden and which supply closet had a broken lock she could use when she needed 60 seconds of silence. Not long enough to stop feeling like a stranger in her own uniform. She was 34, average height, dark hair she kept back in a bun so tight it had started to give her headaches. There was nothing about her that announced itself. No sharp jaw, no confident stride, no voice that carried. She moved through the unit the way water moves through a crack, efficiently, quietly, taking up exactly the space she needed and no more, which was exactly why nobody paid attention to her. Whitmore. The voice hit her before she'd even set down her coffee. Dr. Preston Hale, senior attending for trauma, stood at the nurse's station with a chart in his hand and the particular look on his face he reserved for her. Not quite contempt, not quite annoyance, something in between that he'd never bothered to name. Why is bed 6 still waiting on that blood panel? I ordered it at 9:47, Maya said. Lab has it. Then why don't I have results? Because the lab's running a 2-hour backlog. I flagged it in the system and left a note for Dr. Solis. Hale looked at her the way you look at a smoke detector that keeps going off. Next time, come find me directly. You were in surgery. Then leave a message with my resident. She didn't say anything else. She'd learned early that saying anything else only gave him more surface to push against. He moved away, heels clicking, and she went back to her charting. Across the station, one of the other nurses, a second-year named Brianna, who had very quickly learned which way the wind blew in this unit, gave Maya a sideways glance and then looked back at her screen. That was the texture of Maya's days at Harbor Ridge. Not dramatic cruelty, just erosion. The constant low-grade signal that she didn't quite belong here, wasn't quite trusted, wasn't quite seen as someone worth consulting when things got complicated. She was efficient, she was thorough, she documented everything, and none of it mattered because Dr. Hale had decided within her first 2 weeks that she was just another civilian nurse with ideas above her station, and his opinion had a gravitational pull that bent everything else around it. What he didn't know, what almost nobody here knew, was that Maya had once worked in conditions where a wrong decision didn't result in a complaint filed with HR, where a wrong decision meant a body bag. But that was a different life. She'd left it, or it had left her, and she'd spent 3 years trying to build something ordinary. Ordinary was harder than it looked. The incident that nearly ended her career at Harbor Ridge happened on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before the night everything changed. A patient came in, retired Army, mid-50s, presenting with chest pain and disorientation, standard intake, nothing alarming on the surface. Maya had been assigned to him. She'd noticed something in his presentation that felt off to her. The specific combination of symptoms, the way his pulse was uneven in a pattern she'd seen before in a completely different context. And she'd flagged it in her notes, requested a secondary consult, and asked the charge nurse to loop in cardiology before anything else moved forward. What happened next was not her fault. The charge nurse, overwhelmed and running 3 nurses short, had put the consult request in the wrong queue. The cardiologist on call didn't see it for 90 minutes. By then the patient had deteriorated, been rushed to the ICU, and survived, barely, after an intervention that should have happened 2 hours earlier. Dr. Hale reviewed the case the next morning. By afternoon, Maya had been called into a meeting with him and the nursing director, a compact, precise woman named Judith Cray, who wore her authority the way some people wore expensive shoes, conspicuously and with zero flexibility. The documentation shows a delay in escalation, Cray said, reading from a printed report. The documentation shows I escalated at intake and again at the 40-minute mark, Maya said. The consult was misrouted. Your consult request was incomplete. It had everything required by protocol. Dr. Hale reviewed it. Dr. Hale reviewed it after the fact. Hale didn't flinch. He'd had years of practice looking unbothered in meetings where his version of events was being institutionalized. The fact is, Nurse Whitmore, the outcome here was a near miss. Someone is accountable. She looked at him for a long moment. She knew exactly what was happening. She'd seen enough institutional machinery to recognize when it was being used to redirect blame away from a system failure and toward the nearest available target. And she was, well, conveniently, predictably, the nearest available target. I understand, she said, which was an agreement. It was armor. She received a formal written reprimand 2 days later. Temporary reassignment out of the trauma unit pending a 30-day review. Effective immediately, she was to report to General MedSurg, where her responsibilities would be reduced and her access to trauma patients would be restricted. She packed her locker in 20 minutes, didn't say much to anyone. Brianna watched from the doorway of the break room, and Maya could see the girl wanted to say something and couldn't find the words, and finally just looked away. Maya walked out of the trauma unit at 4:15 in the afternoon, went to her car, sat there for 6 minutes, and then drove home. She didn't cry. Not because she was composed, because she'd been through enough that she'd developed a kind of emotional triage system. First you stabilize, then you process, then you deal with it. She wasn't at the dealing with it stage yet. She ate cereal for dinner. She watched 2 episodes of a documentary about migratory birds. She went to bed at 9. At 2:09 a.m., her phone rang. Harbor Ridge. She almost didn't answer. Oh, she answered. This is Whitmore. It's Calloway, from Overnight Security. His voice was tight. I know you're on suspension, reassignment. Right. Look, I'm not supposed to call you, but something's happening in the ER and Hale is losing it, and we've got a sound in the background, something that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite not. We've got a military working dog down and a SEAL team just rolled in and nobody can... I'll be there in 12 minutes. She didn't think about it, didn't deliberate. The part of her brain that had spent 4 years in classified operational zones simply heard the situation and started moving. She was there in 11. The ER was controlled chaos when she walked through the doors, which was the charitable interpretation. The less charitable one was that it was just chaos, with the word controlled hanging in the air, like a wish nobody had gotten around to making yet. There were 4 of them. Navy SEALs, still in tactical gear, 2 of them bleeding, all of them upright in the way that combat-trained people stay upright even when they shouldn't be, which is to say through sheer refusal rather than any physical capacity. One of them, big, red-haired, with a compress already taped to his left forearm, had his hand wrapped around the collar of the dog. Ranger. Maya saw the name on the vest before she saw anything else. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, about 70 pounds, muzzle dark with blood that wasn't all his own. He was lying on his side on the floor because nobody had gotten a gurney down low enough yet, and his breathing was labored in the specific way that meant something was putting pressure on his chest cavity that shouldn't be there. His handler, the red-haired SEAL, was crouched next to him, speaking very quietly, and the dog's eyes were tracking him with the kind of desperate focus that animals use when they're trying to decide whether to let go. Dr. Hale was standing 8 feet away, arms crossed, talking at a subordinate resident with the clipped efficiency of a man who had already decided this situation was beneath him. We don't treat animals in this facility. The nearest veterinary emergency is 45 minutes, the red-haired SEAL said without looking up. He won't make 45 minutes. I understand your concern, but the liability... Did you just say liability to me? The SEAL looked up then. His eyes were the flat, deliberate kind that come from years of looking at things clearly and making fast calculations. My dog just took a round that was meant for my teammate. He is a United States military asset, and he will receive care. Sir, I am the senior attending in this unit, and I am telling you, I'm not asking. Maya had stopped inside the doorway, reading the room, doing the automatic rapid assessment that she'd spent years training into her nervous system. Ranger's condition, penetrating chest trauma. Likely hemopneumothorax, tension building. Handler's condition, secondary wound to the forearm, not arterial, could wait. Second seal near the wall, concussion. The way he was holding his head gave it away. Third and fourth, mobile. Guarding posture, one of them on a radio. She moved toward Ranger. One of the security officers, Delgado, she knew him, he'd always been mildly hostile to her, stepped sideways to block her path. Whitmore, you're not authorized in this unit. I need a large-bore IV catheter, a chest decompression kit, and 2 liters of saline, she said, stepping around him. Hey, and someone get that gurney down to floor level. He needs to stay lateral. Ma'am. Delgado put a hand on her arm. She looked at the hand, then at him. The look was not aggressive. It was the kind of look that communicated, very efficiently, that she had been in situations significantly worse than this one, and that his hand on her arm was registering as a minor inconvenience at best. Move. He moved. She didn't know why. She thought about it later, and she still didn't fully know. Maybe it was the voice. Maybe it was something in the way she walked, the angle of her shoulders, something that bypassed the part of the brain that processes words and went straight to the part that processes threat assessment. Whatever it was, Delgado stepped back, and Maya knelt next to Ranger. Hey, she said quietly. To the dog, not the handler. Hey, I see you. You're okay. I've got you. The dog's eyes moved to her. Something shifted in them. Not calm, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of being seen by someone who understood what was happening. The red-haired SEAL watched her hands. His name is Petty Officer Rylan Marsh, he said, not introducing himself. The dog. His designation is Ranger. He's been with me 3 years. What happened? Fragmentation. Entry wound left thoracic. I couldn't find an exit. Approximately 40 minutes ago. Has he lost consciousness at any point? Twice. Brief. Maya got her hands on Ranger's chest, feeling with her fingertips, listening to the breathing pattern, building a picture. Who put this compress on him? I did. Good placement. It slowed the external bleed, but the real problem is internal pressure. She looked up at the hovering nurse who'd appeared with a supply tray, a young man named Toby, who had the look of someone who desperately wanted to be helpful and wasn't sure of the rules. Toby, chest decompression kit, you have it? Yes, but Dr. Hale said, Toby. Her voice stayed even. Ranger is going to die in the next 8 minutes if we don't release the pressure in his chest. I need the kit. Toby gave her the kit. Behind her, she heard Hale's voice, clipped and sharp. Whitmore, stop what you're doing right now. She didn't stop. Whitmore, I am giving you a direct order. You are on restricted access. If you continue, then write me up. She had her hands on the dog now, working with the efficiency of someone who'd done this in conditions where the nearest backup was an air support call and 20 minutes away. Or help. Those are your 2 options. Silence from Hale, which was, she knew, a kind of answer. The red-haired SEAL shifted to give her better access. He didn't speak again. He just watched her work. And there was something in his expression she couldn't read yet. Not gratitude, not exactly. Something more careful than that. The decompression worked. The sound that came with it, the hiss of pressure releasing, was one of the more distinctive sounds in emergency medicine, and it cut through the noise of the ER like a signal. Ranger's breathing changed almost immediately. Still ragged, still labored, but the desperate quality left it. There you go, Maya said quietly, to the dog. There you go. She looked up at Toby. I need whole blood, O negative, and I need a vet on the phone. Nearest emergency animal hospital. Get them on a video call right now, because what happens next I want a veterinary consult on. I don't know if we can... Toby? Patient? Get them on the phone. He went. The red-haired SEAL, she still didn't know his name, watched her for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, Where did you train? She didn't answer right away. She was checking Ranger's gum color, a basic perfusion indicator, and she needed to concentrate. Long time ago, she said finally. Different context. What context? She glanced up at him. His eyes hadn't changed, still that flat, careful calculation. But something underneath had shifted slightly, like he was recalibrating something. The kind that doesn't come up in polite conversation, she said. He nodded slowly. Like that was the answer he'd expected. Across the ER, Dr. Hale had gathered himself back up into his full height and was now on the phone, which meant he was either calling hospital administration or legal, and Maya had about 4 minutes before someone with institutional authority arrived and tried to physically remove her from the room. She used those 4 minutes to stabilize Ranger's immediate condition, get the veterinary consult started with Toby running the tablet, and assess the 2 injured SEALs who were still standing. You. She looked at the man with the arm wound, different from the red-haired one, darker, quieter, with a jaw so tight it looked like he'd been clenching it for hours. Sit down before you fall down. That wound needs irrigation and you're running on adrenaline. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're compensating. Sit. He sat. Not because she'd told him to. She could see that in the slight delay before he moved. He sat because his body had made the decision before his pride could stop it. The 4th SEAL, the youngest one, early 20s, with a split lip that had already started swelling, put a hand on her shoulder. She turned. His expression was strange. Ma'am, are you... He stopped, started again. You've done this before. With animals. And people, she said. Where? She was about to deflect. She'd gotten good at deflecting. When the ER doors opened again, and this time the person who walked through them wasn't a nurse or a doctor or a security officer. It was a woman in army dress uniform, lieutenant colonel by the insignia, short, with iron gray hair, and the walk of someone who moved through rooms as a matter of habit rather than permission. Behind her, 2 MPs. And behind them, a man in navy dress whites with admiral stars on his collar who had not been in the city 2 hours ago and whose presence here at 2:30 in the morning meant something had escalated significantly beyond a standard field injury. The woman in army dress stopped 3 feet inside the doorway and swept the room. Her eyes moved efficiently. The SEALs, the dog, Hale on his phone, Maya on the floor, and landed on Maya. Something happened in the woman's expression, something small and controlled, like a micro-expression that had almost escaped before being captured and locked back down. Maya didn't know her, but the woman's eyes moved to Maya's left forearm, where her sleeve had pushed up during the decompression procedure, exposing a scar, long, diagonal, the particular kind that comes from a specific type of blast fragmentation rather than any surgical cause. And the woman went very still. The admiral had stopped just behind her. He was looking at the same scar. And then he said one word. Not Maya's name. A call sign. 6 years old, classified, used in operational zones she'd never discussed with anyone at Harbor Ridge or before Harbor Ridge, or in the careful, ordinary life she'd been trying to construct around the space where that life used to be. He said it quietly, almost to himself, like someone confirming something they hadn't been sure was real. And Maya looked up from Ranger's chart, and the world she'd spent 3 years building started to come apart at the seams. Dr. Hale had finished his phone call. He crossed the room with the energy of a man who had reinforcements coming and knew it. Judith Cray had been reached, the nursing supervisor was on her way, and he had finally the institutional backing he needed to formally remove Maya Whitmore from the unit and deal with the mess she'd created. Admiral Mercer, he said, because he'd clearly been briefed on who was coming, or he'd read the insignia, or both. I apologize for the scene here. We have a situation with a nurse who is operating outside her authorized access. Dr. Hale. The Admiral's voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet, which is different. The kind of quiet that has weight behind it. He hadn't taken his eyes off Maya. What is the dog's current condition? Hale blinked. The animal was... Current condition. Right now. Stable, Maya said. She stood up. Her knees ached. She'd been on the floor for 11 minutes, and the hard linoleum had not been forgiving. Tension pneumothorax decompressed, perfusion improving, IV access established. He needs surgical intervention on the internal bleed, but we've bought time. 40 minutes to an hour before it becomes critical again. Who established care? I did. The Admiral looked at her. Really looked. The way he'd been trying not to since he'd said that word. On what authority? None. She met his eyes. I was restricted from this unit 2 weeks ago. I came in on a security officer's call. If you need to cite me for it, go ahead. I see. He was quiet for a moment, then, what's your name, for the record? She knew he knew it. He was asking her to say it anyway. She didn't know why. Maya Whitmore, Harbor Ridge Trauma Nursing Staff, currently on administrative reassignment. And before Harbor Ridge? The room had gone quiet. Not silent. There were still monitors beeping, still ambient hospital noise. But the people in it had gone quiet. Hale, the resident, Toby with the tablet, the 4 SEALs, the Army Lieutenant Colonel with her MPs, all of them either watching or pretending not to. Maya looked at the Admiral. She looked at the scar on her own arm, the one he'd recognized from across the room in the middle of the night, in an ER she technically wasn't supposed to be in. That's a complicated question, she said. I imagine it is. He took a step toward her, and his voice dropped below the room's threshold. I remember you. I reviewed your file. Twice. I know. You turned down the commendation. I turned down a lot of things. Why? She looked at Ranger, lying on the gurney now that Toby had gotten it lowered, his breathing steadier, the desperate quality gone from his eyes. She looked at the red-haired SEAL, who was watching her with an expression she could now read. It was the expression of someone who had made a correct identification and was waiting to see how long it took everyone else to catch up. Because I was trying to have a normal life, she said. The Admiral exhaled. Not quite a sigh. Something more controlled. Petty Officer Marsh needs surgery within the hour. My understanding is this facility has the capability. It does. You'll coordinate that? I'm restricted from, you will coordinate that, Nurse Whitmore. His voice had changed. Not louder. Just certain, in the way that certain voices get when the person speaking has made a decision and the decision is already done. I'll speak with hospital administration about your access. Right now. Tonight. Hale made a sound. Not quite a word. Something between a protest and a clearing of the throat. Admiral, with respect, there's a process here. An ongoing review. Dr. Hale. The Admiral turned, and there was nothing aggressive in his posture, nothing theatrical. He just turned, and the quality of his attention shifted toward Hale the way a beam of light shifts, completely, without hesitation. Are you the physician who was present when this dog came in? I was, yes. And what intervention did you provide? Silence. It stretched for 3 seconds, which is not a long time in most contexts, and is a very long time in that one. I was assessing the situation, Hale said. I see. The Admiral turned back to Maya. Coordinate the surgical consult. I'll handle the rest. Hale's face had gone a particular color. Not red, not pale, something in between that didn't have a good name. He looked at Maya with an expression she recognized because she'd been on the receiving end of it for 11 months. The expression of someone recalculating their understanding of the territory. She didn't enjoy it as much as she'd expected. Mostly, she was tired. The next 2 hours were work, and Maya threw herself into it the way she always did, thoroughly, methodically, with the particular focused calm that people who've operated in crisis zones develop as a survival mechanism. Ranger went into emergency surgical care with a veterinary surgeon pulled from 30 miles out and a Harbor Ridge resident assisting under Mayo Clinic guidance on video call. The 2 injured SEALs got treated. The young one with the split lip turned out to have a hairline fracture in his orbital socket that he'd been walking around on for 3 hours. Maya was redressing the forearm wound on the dark-haired SEAL, whose name she'd learned was Torres, when he spoke. How long were you in? He asked. She didn't look up from the wound. What makes you think I was in? The way you moved when you came through those doors. He watched her hands. I've seen about 3 people move like that outside of active deployment. One of them was my team leader, and 2 of them were combat medics. I was a nurse. In what context? She taped the final piece of the dressing and sat back. The kind with different rules of engagement. Torres looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the careful, closed-off kind that people who've been through a lot of serious things develop. Not hard, exactly, but guarded. Like he was deciding whether to say the next thing. Ranger made a sound when you talked to him, he said. When you first knelt down. I've seen him with strangers before. He doesn't do that. He was scared. He's a military working dog. He doesn't scare easy. Torres paused. He recognized something in you. Animals do that, with people who've been where we've been. She started packing up the supply tray. He's going to need a few weeks of recovery. The surgery should address the bleed, but the chest wall is going to be sore. He'll need to be kept quiet. I know. Probably won't feel like staying quiet. Neither do I, usually. He almost smiled. Almost. Thank you for what you did tonight. Don't thank me yet. He's still in surgery. I know. I'm thanking you for the part you did. She picked up the tray. Try to rest. You've got a concussion risk sitting against the wall over there, and he's going to need someone coherent to watch him. She'd taken 3 steps when Torres said quietly, The Admiral was right. I know who you are. She stopped. Not your name, he said. The call sign. We heard it. My last deployment. 3 years ago. There were stories. Stories, she said, about a combat medic who came in on a casevac and held a perimeter for 22 minutes alone while extracting 2 critical patients and a working dog that had taken shrapnel in an IED blast. He paused. The dog's name was Colt. He lived. The supply tray in Maya's hands was very still. I didn't know anyone had named it, she said. They named it. She didn't respond. She walked back to the nurse's station, set down the tray, and stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the counter, looking at the wall of whiteboards that tracked patients and status and labs and all the ordinary machinery of a hospital running overnight. Judith Cray arrived at 4:10 a.m. Maya saw her come in, pressed slacks even at this hour, that careful precision in her bearing, and braced herself for the institutional machinery to kick back into gear. Cray scanned the room, found Maya, and crossed toward her with the expression of a woman who had been woken up in the middle of the night and intended to hold someone accountable for it. She got halfway across the room before the Admiral stepped into her path. The conversation that followed was brief. Maya couldn't hear it. She could see Cray's expression move through several stages: authority, certainty, then something that looked a lot like the specific discomfort of realizing you're holding a position that has just become untenable. When Cray walked away, she didn't look at Maya. The Admiral came to the station instead. He stood next to her, not looming, not performing authority, just standing there the way people stand when they're deciding how to begin a thing. The surgical team thinks Ranger will make it, he said. Good. Petty Officer Marsh is asking about him. Tell him the numbers. He'll want the numbers, not the reassurance. You know him? I know the type. She looked sideways. You're going to tell me something I'm not going to like. He almost smiled. It was a tired smile, the smile of someone who'd been awake as long as she had. We've been looking for you for a while. I wasn't hiding. You were very effectively not advertising yourself. That's different, is it? She turned to face him properly. In the gray fluorescent light of 4 a.m., he looked older than his rank photo, which she'd never seen, had never had occasion to see, and more human. There was something worn in him that she hadn't expected. What do you want, Admiral? Right now? He met her eyes. I want to know how a decorated combat medic with your record ended up getting written up for a routine documentation failure in a mid-sized military hospital. She was quiet for a moment. Because I let my guard down, she said finally. Because I thought ordinary was an option. And now? She looked at the ER. At Torres, who'd finally agreed to sit in a chair and was watching the door to the surgical suite. At the young SEAL with the orbital fracture who'd fallen asleep sitting up, which was impressive. At Toby, who was still at the nurse's station and had the look of someone who had just seen something that significantly reorganized his understanding of what nurses could be. At the door to the surgical suite, behind which Ranger was fighting to stay in the world. Now I'm trying to figure out what just walked through my ER doors, she said. The Admiral looked at her for a long moment. Not what, he said. Who? She turned to look at him. We'll talk in the morning, he said. After the dog is out of surgery and you've had 3 hours of sleep. But I need you to understand something right now tonight, before anything else happens. He paused. The situation that brought us here tonight, the attack that injured my men, is not resolved. And the people who knew we were operating in this area? He let that land. Someone in this facility, he said quietly, with the specific weight of someone who has already done the math and doesn't like the answer, told them. Maya went very still. "Sleep," he said. "3 hours. And then we talk." He walked away, and Maya stood at the nurse's station in the 4 a.m. gray of Harbor Ridge Military Medical Center and felt the floor of the ordinary life she'd been building shift under her feet in a way she recognized from a long time ago. The feeling of a mission beginning. The feeling of a door she'd thought was closed turning out to have been waiting. And underneath that, quieter than either of those things, the feeling of something she hadn't expected. A small, steady anger, aimed with precision at the people who had taken 11 months of her careful, methodical, thorough work and used it to cover their own failures, who had written her up for a mistake she hadn't made and called it process, who had told her to stay in her lane without knowing what lanes she'd navigated. Down the hall, behind a closed surgical suite door, Ranger was fighting. In the ER, the Admiral's words were still in the air. Someone in this facility told them. Maya reached for her phone. She had 3 hours. She knew exactly how she was going to use them. She didn't sleep. She'd told herself 3 hours, and she'd meant it when she said it. But somewhere between walking to the on-call room and lying down on the narrow cot with her shoes still on, her brain had simply refused to downshift. It kept running the math. The Admiral's words, the timing of the attack, the specific geography of how information moved through a hospital, who had access to what, who talked to whom, which systems logged, which queries. Someone in this facility told them. She stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes, then gave up, sat up, and opened her phone. She had contacts she hadn't used in years. Numbers that probably still worked because the people who owned them lived lives where their numbers had to keep working, where being unreachable was a liability rather than a preference. She scrolled past them for now. What she needed first wasn't people. It was pattern. She went back through everything she could access from her phone, her own personnel file, which she had a copy of because she'd learned early to document everything about herself before someone else documented it for her. The incident report from the Delgado case. Her original escalation request from 2 weeks ago, time-stamped, still in her saved messages because she'd forwarded it to her personal email the day it happened. The timeline was clear. She'd escalated at intake and at 40 minutes. The consult had been misrouted. The patient had deteriorated. And then, with a speed that didn't match the pace of how administrative reviews usually worked, Hale had moved to formalize her reprimand within 18 hours of the incident. 18 hours was fast. She'd seen complaint processes take weeks in institutions half this size. Either Hale had been waiting for an opportunity, or something had made him move faster than usual. She thought about that. Then she thought about the attack. The Admiral had said his men were operating in this area, which was deliberate vagueness, military speak for an ongoing operation she didn't have clearance details on. But someone had known they were in the vicinity of Caldwell. Someone had known specifically enough to mount an attack that put a SEAL team in the ER at 2 a.m. She wasn't drawing conclusions yet. She was just holding the two things next to each other and noticing they didn't feel unrelated. At 6:47 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, which meant someone had gotten her contact from a source she hadn't given it to. Surgery finished, dog stable. Admiral wants the meeting at 0800, room 114. She texted back, "I'll be there." Then she got up, splashed water on her face in the on-call room's tiny bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror for about 3 seconds, long enough to note that she looked exactly as tired as she felt and that there was nothing to be done about it, and went to find coffee. Room 114 turned out to be a small conference room on the administrative floor that Maya had been in exactly once before for her initial orientation meeting 11 months ago. It had a table that seated 8, a whiteboard someone had forgotten to erase, and a window that looked out onto the parking structure. Not a glamorous venue for whatever this was about to be. The Admiral was already there when she arrived at 7:58. So was the Army Lieutenant Colonel, whose name, Maya now knew from the badge she'd had a chance to read, was Voss, and 2 other people she didn't recognize. One was a man in civilian clothes who had the specific quality of stillness that usually meant either law enforcement or intelligence. The other was a woman in her 50s with short silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, who had a tablet in front of her and the brisk efficiency of someone who had already been working for 3 hours. Marsh was there too. The red-haired SEAL, the one who'd been with Ranger. He had a fresh bandage on his arm and the look of a man who'd agreed to sit in a chair as a temporary compromise and intended to stand up again the first chance he got. Maya sat down. She didn't wait for an invitation. "How's Ranger?" she said. "Resting," Marsh said. "They've got him in some kind of veterinary recovery area. I've been in twice already, and the nurse down there told me to stop hovering." "Good advice." "I know." He didn't look like he was going to take it. The Admiral, Mercer, she reminded herself, Admiral Caleb Mercer, set a folder on the table, but didn't open it. "I'll be direct," he said. "We don't have a lot of time, and I'd rather use it well." He looked at Maya. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at a level above your current clearance. I'm extending a temporary operational read-in for the purposes of this conversation. Petty Officer Marsh is aware of the parameters. Colonel Voss will note it for the record." Voss nodded, typing something on her tablet without looking up. "3 weeks ago," Mercer continued, "my team began a localized intelligence operation in the Caldwell area. The objective was identifying the source of leaked operational data that's been compromising SOCOM movement in this region for the past 4 months. What that means in practical terms is that someone has been feeding specific, accurate information about special operations movements to a hostile network, routes, timing, personnel attachments." He paused. Ranger's team was the 3rd unit hit. The first 2 involved casualties. Maya kept her face steady. "What's the connection to this hospital?" The leaked data in all 3 incidents included medical routing information, evacuation protocols, facility designations for medevac. He looked at her directly. Information that would only be accessible through a hospital system with military contracts. Harbor Ridge has military contracts. Harbor Ridge has 3 of them, and is the designated medevac facility for the installation 8 miles east. He opened the folder. Inside was a single page with a list of names. She could see them but didn't read them yet, waiting. "We've been conducting a passive signals analysis of the facility's communications for 6 days. 2 days ago, we identified a pattern. Specific query logs, medical record accesses that don't match any legitimate clinical workflow." The man in civilian clothes, who still hadn't introduced himself, slid a printed sheet across the table. She picked it up. System access logs, timestamps, user IDs, anonymized but with a code she'd need the key to read. "We know the user ID associated with the breach," he said. His voice had the particular flat quality of someone who had delivered a lot of information in contexts where the information was consequential. "We've confirmed it from 3 different access points. The question is the full scope. How long, what was specifically transmitted, and whether there are secondary actors." "What does this have to do with me?" she asked. Mercer and Voss exchanged a look that was brief and contained and told her nothing, except that they'd already discussed this part. "We need someone inside the facility," Voss said. "Someone with legitimate access who can move through the system without triggering awareness. Someone the staff doesn't expect to be looking." Maya set the sheet down. "I'm on restricted access." "That's being resolved this morning." Mercer's voice was matter-of-fact. "Your reprimand is being formally reviewed. Based on what I've already communicated to hospital administration, I expect the restriction to be lifted within the hour." "Based on what you communicated," she said, "meaning this was planned." "No." He said it clearly, without hedging. "Last night was not planned. We came to Harbor Ridge because my men needed medical care and it was the designated facility. Finding you here, in the circumstances we found you, was not anticipated." He paused. "But I'd be lying if I said we weren't going to make use of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then at Marsh, who was watching her with his arms crossed and an expression she'd begun to read as his default. Alert, contained, not giving much away. "You knew," she said to him. "When you recognized me last night, you knew who I was." "I knew the call sign," he said. "I didn't know where you'd landed. When I saw how you moved, I started putting it together." "And you flagged it." "Yeah." No apology in it, just confirmation. She turned back to the table. The civilian intelligence man had his hands folded and was watching her with the careful patience of someone who was very good at waiting people out. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a long pause. "What specifically do you need from me?" she said. The answer was less cinematic than she'd expected and more detailed, which was usually how real things worked. What they needed was access to the physical files in the medical records annex. an older storage system that hadn't been fully migrated to digital, which meant the query logs didn't capture it, which meant whoever was accessing it hadn't been triggering the digital signals analysis. If there was a physical component to the breach, and Voss believed there was, it would be in that annex. Maya had access to the annex. Most nursing staff did, for continuity of care purposes. It wouldn't raise flags for her to be there. She knew the layout. She knew the staff rotation well enough to know when the annex was unmonitored. "I need to know who I'm looking for," she said. The civilian, who had finally, grudgingly, given a name that she suspected was not his real one, just Falk, pulled the access log sheet back and wrote 2 letters on a post-it, user initials. He slid it across. She looked at the letters. Something went flat in her chest. Not surprise, exactly. More like the specific feeling of a suspicion being confirmed that you'd hoped wouldn't be. The initials were P.H. Preston Hale. She looked up. "You're sure?" "The access pattern is consistent across 9 incidents over 4 months," Falk said. "We're not operating on assumption." "Then why do you need me? You have the data." "Data isn't enough," Voss said. "We need physical evidence, the annex records. And we need it before he knows we're looking, because if he rabbits, we lose the network above him. He's not the top. He's a conduit." Maya thought about Hale, about his face in the meeting where he'd formalized her reprimand, about the speed of it, 18 hours, about a man with institutional authority who'd been careful to position himself as the one who caught mistakes rather than the one who made them, about the particular kind of arrogance that comes from feeling safe. "If I go into the annex and he finds out," she started. "He won't find out from us," Falk said. "I'm not worried about you." "Then be careful," Voss said simply. It wasn't reassurance. It was an acknowledgement that the situation carried risk and that they were all aware of it and that they were asking her anyway. Maya appreciated the honesty, reassurance she wouldn't have trusted. "One condition," she said. Mercer waited. "Whatever you find, whatever the full scope is, the nursing staff that got caught in the middle of his documentation games, the incident reports he used as cover, the patients whose care was compromised, all of it goes on record, not just the intelligence breach, the medical malfeasance." Mercer nodded. "Agreed. In writing. Colonel Voss." Voss was already typing. The annex was on the 2nd floor, past the radiology wing, in a corridor that most of the hospital had collectively decided was someone else's problem. The fluorescent light at the far end had been flickering for 6 weeks. The cart outside the door had been there so long it had become invisible. Maya walked past it at 9:20 a.m., badge swiped, access confirmed. The restriction on her record now formally lifted per 8:51 a.m., administrative memo she'd received while drinking her 2nd cup of coffee. She had 30 minutes before the records clerk came back from her break rotation. The physical files were organized by year and then by case classification. Maya knew what she was looking for. The specific case numbers from the access log, 3 of them, corresponding to the 3 incidents Mercer's team had been tracking. She found the first 2 within 7 minutes. Both showed signs of recent handling, pages slightly out of alignment, the kind of microscopic disturbance that people who aren't paying attention to physical evidence don't notice, and people who've worked in environments where physical evidence matters very much do. She photographed them. Falk had given her a specific small scanner, no bigger than a thick pen, that captured metadata alongside image data. She worked fast, but not frantic. Frantic was how you missed things. The 3rd file wasn't in its slot. She checked twice, then checked the adjacent slots in case of misfiling, then checked the overflow cart near the back wall, which was where things landed when someone had been using them and hadn't put them back properly. It wasn't there either. She stood in the middle of the annex for a moment, thinking. A missing file could mean several things. It could mean it had been pulled for legitimate clinical reasons and was in someone's office. It could mean it had been refiled incorrectly in a different section. Or it could mean someone had already removed it, which had a more specific set of implications. She pulled out her phone and texted Falk's number. 3rd file absent, looking for alternatives. His response came in under 30 seconds. "Don't extend the window. Get out at 30 minutes. She typed back. "Understood." Then she kept looking. She found it in the wrong decade, filed under a year it had no business being in, slid in between 2 thick folders in a way that looked like haste rather than accident. Someone had put it there quickly, not carefully. She pulled it. The moment she opened it, she understood why. Inside the standard medical file were 2 pages that shouldn't have been there, not clinical documents. Printed communications, the kind of thing you'd print if you didn't want a digital record of sending them, but you needed physical confirmation of the content. The header was partially obscured, but the routing information was visible. A logistics email chain, timestamps, and embedded in the body of the message, coordinates. Operational coordinates. The kind that corresponded to movement routes for military personnel. Her hand was steady. She photographed every page. She put the file back exactly where she'd found it. Same position, same neighboring folders, same angle of insertion. She checked her watch, 27 minutes. She left the annex, turned the corner into the radiology corridor, and walked directly into Dr. Preston Hale. He was coming from the direction of the administrative offices, which wasn't unusual. He had meetings up there regularly. He was wearing his white coat and carrying a coffee, and he had the particular focused expression of a man thinking about something other than where he was walking, which was why he almost didn't see her until he was 3 feet away. Then he did. The shift in his expression was small, a fraction of a second where something moved behind his eyes. Not quite alarm, but its quieter cousin, the thing that lives next door to alarm and knocks on the wall sometimes. Whitmore. His voice was measured. I heard your restriction was lifted. This morning, she said. He looked at her. Not at her face, she noticed. At her hands. At what she was holding, which was nothing because she'd pocketed the scanner before leaving the annex and her hands were empty. His eyes came back up to her face. You were in the annex. It wasn't a question. Continuity of care retrieval, she said. Patient from last week's med-surg rotation. You know how the migration gaps work. He was quiet for a moment. His coffee was in his right hand. She watched his left hand, which had tightened slightly against the seam of his coat. Barely, just a degree of tension most people wouldn't catch. Of course, he said, smooth, the smoothness of long practice. Well, welcome back to full access. He moved past her. She walked in the opposite direction and did not look back because looking back tells people they got to you. But she knew, with the specific certainty of someone who'd spent years reading threat indicators in environments where getting it wrong meant dying, that he hadn't believed her, and that meant the clock had just started running. She found Marsh in the recovery area where they'd set up Ranger, which was technically a repurposed storage room off the ground floor surgical wing that had been hastily converted with a padded mat and a portable monitoring unit. Marsh was sitting on an upturned crate beside the dog, and Ranger was awake, barely, the soft-eyed awake of heavy sedation, and had his head resting against Marsh's knee. Maya stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at them. There was something in the image that landed differently than she expected. The big seal with his fresh bandage and his road-worn face, and the dog who'd come back from the edge of something bad, and the quality of the quiet between them. Not comfortable exactly, because neither of them was built for comfortable, but real. He's tracking better, she said. Yeah. Marsh didn't look up. He recognized my voice about an hour ago, actually lifted his head. Good sign. Sign. Best sign I've had all week. He looked up then, read something in her face. What happened? I ran into Hale in the radiology corridor. And? He knows I was in the annex. She came in, let the door close behind her, kept her voice low. He didn't say it, but he knew. Marsh was quiet for a moment, then, how long do we have? If he moves to cover his tracks, hours, maybe. If he reaches out to the network above him, less. She crouched down, at Ranger's level, and the dog's eyes moved to her with the same quality they'd had the night before, that specific recognition. She put her hand near his nose without touching, letting him come to her. He did, a slow, exhausted press of his muzzle. Falk needs to know. Already texted him, Marsh said. He'd had his phone out, apparently, while she was watching the dog. He says they're moving up the timeline. To what? He didn't say. She looked at Ranger's monitors. Vitals stable. Better than they'd been 3 hours ago. The chest drain was in, the surgical incision sites were clean. He was going to make it. She'd known that since the annex, not from medical evidence, but from something less rational, the sense that something this stubborn didn't quit. What was the operation, she asked. The one that got hit. Marsh looked at her. I know I'm not fully read in, she said. I'm not asking for the details. I'm asking what kind. He considered for a moment. Courier intercept, someone moving documents out of the installation. Physical documents. Yeah. She thought about the pages she'd found in the misfiled folder, the printed communications, the coordinates. Hale wasn't just a conduit for data, she said slowly. He was receiving physical packages. Marsh went very still. What makes you say that? Because the third file had documents in it that weren't clinical. Routing information, coordinates, the kind of thing you'd print and pass physically rather than send digitally if you were worried about signals detection. You photographed them. Yes. Where's the scanner? She patted her left pocket. Marsh stood up. His movement was careful, conscious of the dog against his leg, and slow in the way that big men in pain sometimes move, treating their own bodies as equipment that needs maintenance. We need to get that to Falk right now. I know. She stood too. But if we move too fast and Hale sees the pattern, Falk will manage the pattern. His voice was certain in the way that came from trusting a system rather than from blind faith. That's what they do. What he needs is what you found. She looked at him. At the steadiness in him, the particular quality of a man who'd spent years learning when to hold ground and when to move, and had gotten good at telling the difference. It wasn't comfort, it was competence. She'd always trusted competence more than comfort. Okay, she said. She reached into her pocket for the scanner. The door to the recovery room opened. It wasn't Falk. It wasn't Mercer or Voss or anyone from the morning meeting. It was Judith Cray, nursing director, and she had two people behind her, not medical staff, not security. A man and a woman in what looked like hospital administration attire, the specific bland professional clothing of people who carried institutional authority rather than clinical credentials. Cray's face was the careful, composed face of someone who had rehearsed this. Nurse Whitmore, I need you to come with me. Maya felt the scanner in her palm, felt Marsh beside her, the slight shift in his weight that wasn't movement yet but was the preparation for it. Why? She said. There's been a complaint filed regarding your conduct in the medical was holding a tablet, not looking up, doing something that had the quality of documentation happening in real time. Maya looked at Cray, looked at the two people behind her, looked at the door. The only exit from the recovery room, currently occupied. In her left hand, the scanner sat in her palm. She looked at Marsh. The look lasted less than a second. He read it the way people read looks when they've been trained to communicate in situations where talking isn't an option. His hand moved to his phone. Of course, Maya said to Cray, keeping her voice even. Let me just... Now, please, Cray said. The man with the tablet finally looked up. His eyes went to Cray, then to Maya, then, briefly, deliberately, to Maya's left hand. And in that moment, Maya understood that the man with the tablet was not a hospital administrator. He wasn't holding the tablet like someone taking notes. He was holding it like someone managing a process, the screen angled just enough that she couldn't read it, his thumb moving in a pattern that wasn't typing. It was navigating. System navigation, the kind you do when you're executing a pre-built workflow rather than composing anything new. Maya had 3 seconds to make a decision. She made it. Her left hand, the one with the scanner, dropped to her side, and in the same motion she turned slightly toward Ranger's monitoring unit, as if checking a reading. The movement was small and natural, and covered the half-second it took her to slide the scanner under the padded mat Ranger was lying on, pressing it flat against the wall edge where it disappeared into the shadow of the mat's overhang. Then she straightened up and looked at Cray. Of course, she said again. Lead the way. Marsh hadn't moved. He was still sitting on his crate, one hand resting on Ranger's flank, his phone face down on his knee. She didn't look at him directly. She didn't need to. She'd made the exchange as clear as she could without words, and either he'd read it or he hadn't. She followed Cray out of the room. Doug. The meeting they brought her to was not room 114. It was an office on the 3rd floor she'd never been in, belonged to the hospital's legal compliance division, a department that existed in that bureaucratic middle space between administration and accountability and managed, impressively, to embody neither. The desk had someone else's nameplate on it. The two people who'd come with Cray sat down on one side of the table, and Maya sat on the other, and Cray positioned herself near the door in the way that wasn't quite blocking it, but wasn't quite not. The woman spoke first. She had thin-framed glasses, and the kind of composure that comes from having difficult conversations for a living. Nurse Whitmore, I'm Dr. Ansell, Hospital Compliance. This is Mr. Greer. A nod toward the man with the tablet. We've received a report indicating that this morning you accessed files in the medical records annex that fall outside your assigned patient load. I explained to Dr. Cray. It was continuity of care retrieval for a med-surg patient. The specific files you accessed, Greer said, still looking at his tablet, are flagged under a restricted case classification. Access requires supervisor authorization. I wasn't aware of the restriction. The access prompt displays a warning. She looked at him steadily. Then I may have misread the prompt. I was working quickly. Which files did you access? She named one, a genuine file she'd handled early in the session, a patient she'd actually cared for in med-surg. She gave the case number from memory, accurate, without hesitation. Greer typed it. His expression didn't change, which told her either the file checked out or he wasn't actually checking it. She thought it was the second thing. Dr. Ansell folded her hands. We'd like to review your badge access log for this morning. You have the right to do that. We'd also like your personal phone. There it was. Maya let a beat pass. Not long, just the natural pause of someone processing an unexpected request. For what purpose? Standard protocol, when a data security concern is raised. Am I being accused of something specific? This is a preliminary review. Then I'd like to know my rights under hospital policy before surrendering personal property. She kept her voice professional, not combative, not compliant. The tone of someone who knew the policy existed and intended to use it. I believe I'm entitled to a union representative or a personal advocate for any review that involves personal device access. Ansell and Greer exchanged a look. It was brief and calibrated and told her they'd anticipated some friction, but had expected less specific friction than this. Of course, Ansell said. We can schedule the formal review. I'd like to call my representative now, if that's acceptable. Another look. We'll give you a few minutes. They left her in the room with Cray, which was its own calculation. Cray as witness, Cray as monitor. Maya pulled out her phone and opened her contacts, and instead of calling a union rep, she didn't actually have one, had never gotten around to that particular piece of administrative self-protection, she sent a text to the number Mercer had given her at the end of the morning meeting. 3 words. They're moving now. She put the phone to her ear and had a quiet, one-sided conversation with nobody for 90 seconds, being careful to end it with, "Thank you, I'll wait for your call back," before lowering the phone. Cray hadn't moved from the door. She was looking at a point slightly to the left of Maya's head, with the expression of a woman who had decided that if she didn't make eye contact, she wasn't technically participating in whatever this was. "Judith?" Maya said. Cray's eyes moved to her. "How long have you known?" The question was deliberate, open enough to be about almost anything. She watched Cray's face and saw the specific micro-response she'd been looking for. A slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional compression of the lips, and then the careful reassembly of professional composure. "I don't know what you mean," Cray said. "Okay," Maya said, and left it there, because sometimes leaving something there does more work than following it up. The silence lasted for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Maya knew because she watched the time on her phone, which was the only thing worth looking at in the room. Then the door opened, and it wasn't Ansell or Greer. It was Colonel Voss. Behind her, one of the MPs from the night before, and a man in a suit who had a federal agency quality about him that wasn't the same as Falk, but came from the same general neighborhood. And in Voss's hand, a document, physical, folded, sealed with a stamp that Maya recognized at 40 feet as the kind of stamp that ended bureaucratic arguments. "This room is now part of an active federal investigation," Voss said. Not loudly, just clearly, in the tone of someone who didn't need volume because the words carried their own weight. "Dr. Cray, you're asked to step out. Mr. Greer and Dr. Ansell will be interviewed separately." Cray opened her mouth. "That wasn't a request," Voss said. Cray left. The man in the suit stayed near the door. Voss set the document on the table in front of Maya and sat down across from her. "You all right?" "Fine." Maya looked at the document, a federal material witness and evidence protection order, exactly what she'd thought it was. "Did Marsh get the scanner?" "He did. Falk has it." "The document's in the 3rd file." "I know." Voss's voice was steady. "He's already working on them. The coordinates match a route that was used 6 days ago for a supply transfer that got hit. 3 personnel injured, 1 critical. She folded her hands. You found the physical link we've been trying to establish for 4 months. Maya didn't let herself feel anything about that yet. Hale knows I was in the annex. When Greer and Ansel came for me, that was him, wasn't it? He triggered it. Yes. Which means he's trying to get ahead of it. He made 3 external calls in the 90 minutes between when you ran into him in the radiology corridor and when Ansel's office contacted Dr. Cray. Voss looked at her carefully. We have the call records. One of them was to a number that's been on our watch list for 6 weeks. Maya absorbed that. You've been surveilling his communications. Since day 3 of the signals analysis. We just didn't have the physical evidence to move on. Voss paused. Now we do. Falk and his team are executing a detainment order for Hale as of approximately 11 minutes ago. Maya looked at the table, at the document in front of her, at her own hands, which were steady, had been steady all morning, through the annex and the corridor and the compliance office and all of it, and which she now noticed were a little cold. He's been doing this for 4 months, she said, at minimum, possibly longer. And the reprimand, we believe he became aware approximately 3 weeks ago that an internal audit was being considered. The reprimand was likely preemptive, establishing a paper trail that made you look like a liability before you could become a credible witness. The specific cruelty of that landed in a way she hadn't expected. Not because she was surprised, she'd suspected something like it since the morning meeting, but because hearing it confirmed, laid out in clean bureaucratic logic, was different from suspecting it. He'd looked at her and calculated that she was useful as a scapegoat, had written her up for a mistake that wasn't hers, had walked her out of the trauma unit with a formal reprimand on her record, had reduced her to a problem to be managed, all of it deliberately, all of it as a structural move to protect himself. Okay, she said. Voss looked at her. Okay? I mean, I understand. She looked up. What happens now? What happened now was, as these things always were, slower and more procedural than the situation felt like it deserved. Hale was detained at 10:47 a.m. in the hospital's administrative parking structure, attempting to leave the building with a laptop bag and a hard case she later learned contained a second encrypted phone and approximately 400 pages of printed documents. The detainment itself was quiet, no scene in the lobby, no handcuffs visible to the staff who were starting their mid-morning routines. The kind of arrest designed to be comprehensible only in retrospect. Maya heard about it from Marsh, not from Voss or Falk, which told her something about how information moved between the military and the intelligence operation running alongside it. Marsh found her in the corridor outside the compliance office at 11:10, walking with the careful deliberateness of a man whose arm had been properly treated and who had accepted that rest was temporarily off the table. He's in custody, Marsh said. I know. How are you doing? She looked at him sideways. Why does everyone keep asking me that? Because you've been awake for, he paused to calculate, 31 hours and you just navigated a federal evidence operation in a hospital that was trying to fire you. I've had longer. That's not a health metric. She almost smiled. It was the first time all morning something in her had loosened even slightly, and it surprised her, the way small things can surprise you when the big things have been taking up all the available space. Ranger's still stable? I just came from there. He ate something. That's a good sign. He ate the corner of a surgical drape and looked extremely pleased with himself, so I'm calling it a recovery milestone. He fell into step beside her and they walked without a destination for a moment, which felt strange and also necessary. The team that came with Mercer is going to want to debrief you. All of it. The annex, the documents, the encounter with Hale in the corridor. I know. They'll ask about your prior operational history. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. They'd reached the window at the end of the corridor, the one that looked out over the east parking lot, where she could see, if she looked carefully, the still-present black SUVs that had arrived with Voss's team. You could have said no, he said, this morning, when Mercer laid it out. I know. Why didn't you? She looked out at the parking lot. The gray morning had turned into a gray afternoon, Caldwell weather, which was rarely dramatic, just persistent. Because I was already in it, she said. When I walked into that ER last night, I was already in it. Saying no afterward wouldn't have changed what I knew. She paused. And because Hale put a reprimand on my record for a mistake I didn't make, and I'd like that corrected. Marsh looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted from its default, careful quality to something more direct. That's a very clean way to describe it. I'm a practical person. Right. He almost smiled too. Sure you are. She didn't pursue that. She had 3 hours before the debrief Voss had scheduled, and she needed coffee and possibly food, in that order, and she was starting to feel the 31 hours in her lower back in a way that was going to be a real problem by evening. She was halfway to the break room when her pager went off. Not her phone. Her hospital pager, the outdated system. Harbor Ridge still ran alongside the digital alerts because the cellular coverage in the sub-basement was unreliable, and nobody had budgeted to fix it. The pager going off meant someone had activated the trauma alert through the hospital's internal system. She read the code on the small screen. Mass casualty event. Inbound. 20 minutes. She stopped walking. Well, the radio traffic came through in pieces, and Toby, who had apparently decided that Maya was someone he should report to, a decision she hadn't authorized but wasn't going to argue with at this particular moment, relayed it in the corridor outside the trauma unit with the fast, precise delivery of someone who'd been paying attention. 3 vehicles from the installation, 8 miles east, he said. It's not a drill. 2 of the vehicles took fire, the detail that was transporting the personnel from the overnight operation. There are 6 casualties inbound, 2 of them critical. ETA, 17 minutes. Maya was doing the math before he finished. She looked at the trauma unit, her unit, the one she'd been walked out of 2 weeks ago and readmitted to 3 hours ago, and which was, right now, running on overnight staffing because the morning shift had been disrupted by the events of the past 12 hours. She looked at the available attending roster, 1 junior surgeon, 1 second-year resident, 2 nurses, neither of whom had mass casualty training. Hale was in federal custody. The senior attending backup on call was a general surgeon named Ford, who she'd met twice and who had 0 trauma-specific experience. "Get Ford in here," she said, "and call Solis, Dr. Solis, cardiothoracic. Tell him it's a mass casualty and I need him even if he's off the clock." She moved into the unit. "Toby, I need a full trauma bay set up for 6. IVs, blood products, chest kits, the intubation trays, all of it out and ready. Do you know how to run the blood bank request?" "Yes. O negative on standby. At least 12 units. Go." She was pulling on gloves and an isolation gown when Voss appeared at the unit entrance. Behind her, 2 of the MPs and, she processed this in a half-second, the young SEAL with the orbital fracture, whose name she'd learned was Declan, and who looked like he'd decided that his injured eye socket was not sufficient reason to stop being useful. "What's the situation?" Voss said. The personnel transport from the installation was hit. Maya was moving, checking the trauma bays, assessing what was there and what was missing. 6 casualties inbound. "Our people?" "The radio traffic said the escort detail. I don't have specifics." She stopped and looked at Voss directly. "I need to know. Is the facility secure? If Hale's network knew about the transport route, they might also know about—" "We have people at every entrance." Voss's voice was clipped. "Focus on the casualties. We'll handle perimeter. I need you to keep the administrative disruption out of this unit for the next 2 hours. Whatever review process Ansel's office started, whatever compliance flag is still in the system." "Already suspended," Voss said. "Federal order. You have full operational authority in this unit as of now." Maya nodded. That was the right answer, and she didn't need to say anything else about it. She went to work. The ambulances came in waves. The first 2 arrived together at 17 minutes, the third and fourth 4 minutes after that, the last 2 coming in from a different route at a delay. She didn't have time to analyze. The 6 casualties were 2 with penetrating gunshot wounds to the torso, 1 with severe blast injuries to the lower extremities, 1 with a head wound that was either a grazing shot or a full penetration and wouldn't be determinable until imaging, 1 with shrapnel in the neck who was talking, which was good, but whose airway she immediately flagged as a priority because of the specific location of the fragmentation, and 1 who was unconscious on arrival with a blood pressure that was 70/40 and dropping. She triaged in 30 seconds, moved the unconscious patient to Bay 1, the neck shrapnel to Bay 2, the 2 torso wounds to Bays 3 and 4. Ford and his resident took 3. She took 1 and directed Toby and a nurse named Erica she'd worked with in the unit before to Bay 2. The unconscious patient was Army. She read the uniform as she worked, filed it away. Female, mid-30s, wedding ring, a tattoo on her right forearm. She didn't stop to read. BP still falling despite the 2 large-bore IVs the paramedics had already established. She called the blood pressure and the rhythm simultaneously, did her rapid assessment with her hands while her brain constructed the likely mechanism. Blast concussive force plus what felt like a splenic injury based on the left-sided guarding and the bruising pattern visible at the left flank. "Get me a fast exam," she said. "Focused abdominal sonography for trauma. And somebody get Solis on the phone right now. Tell him suspected splenic lac. I need him in Bay 1. The fast confirmed it in 90 seconds. Free fluid in the abdomen, left upper quadrant, significant. The spleen was bleeding, and it wasn't a slow bleed. She needs the OR, Maya said. Now, not soon. OR is prepping, Erica said from across the unit. 5 minutes. We don't have 5 minutes. Maya had a pressure bag on one of the IV lines, running fluids in as fast as the line would allow, buying time in the most literal sense of the expression. Is Solis here? Coming through the door, someone called. Dr. Solis was 61 years old, had a cardiothoracic specialty that technically made abdominal trauma a little outside his lane, and had been practicing medicine since before Maya was born. He came through the trauma unit doors still buttoning his coat, took one look at Bay 1 and said, "What have you got?" "Blunt splenic lac, free fluid on fast. Pressure's been 68 systolic for the last 90 seconds despite 2 large-bore IVs and a pressure bag. She needs a splenectomy. Has she moved?" "Not spontaneously. GCS of 6 on arrival, now 8. Pupils reactive but sluggish, so there's also a head component we haven't imaged yet." He was already gloved, already at the bedside. His hands went to the patient's abdomen with the particular economy of someone who'd done this thousands of times. "She'll need to be on the table before we can know what we're dealing with." "I know. Or 3 minutes, Erica called. "Can she wait 3 minutes? Solis asked Maya. She looked at the monitor. At the blood pressure that had ticked up slightly with the aggressive fluid and blood product resuscitation. 82 systolic now, still terrible, but moving the right direction. "Marginally," she said. "If she gets the blood products and if that number stays above 80, then let's keep it above 80. He looked at her over the patient's body with the direct look of someone who'd stopped caring about hierarchy a long time ago and only cared about the work. "You're staying on her?" "Until she's in the OR." "Good." He moved to the next bay. She stayed with her patient, watching the monitor, adjusting the pressors, talking to the woman who probably couldn't hear her but who she talked to anyway. Low and practical, not reassuring nonsense, just what was happening and what came next. Because that was what she'd always believed people deserved even when they were unconscious. The facts. The plan. Someone in the room paying attention. The 3 minutes were the longest 3 minutes she'd had in a while. The unit was loud. The organized chaos of multiple simultaneous traumas, overlapping voices, the specific percussion of medical equipment in active use. Through it, she tracked. Bay 2's neck shrapnel patient was being intubated as a precautionary airway protection, the right call. Bay 3, one of the torso wounds, was being prepped for emergency surgery. Bay 4 was stable enough to move to imaging. The head wound patient was in Bay 5, a room away, where the resident was managing with supervision. The OR called ready. They moved her patient. Maya scrubbed at the sink outside the OR and thought, briefly, about the fact that 8 hours ago she'd been sitting in an on-call room trying to convince herself to sleep. The way a day could reorganize itself without warning. The way everything could become different from what it was in the space of a single phone call, a single word spoken across an emergency room by a man who'd recognized a scar. She pushed through the OR doors. The surgery took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The splenectomy was technically Solis's. She was there to manage the trauma resuscitation, the ongoing blood product replacement, the blood pressure that kept trying to trend downward every time they addressed one bleed and found another. The patient's name, she learned from the chart that Toby had handed her before she scrubbed in, was Sergeant Dara Finch. She was 37. The ring was titanium, not gold. The tattoo on her forearm was a unit insignia. At 2:51 p.m., Sergeant Finch's blood pressure stabilized at 110 systolic, and held there for 4 minutes, then 5, then 8. "She's through," Solis said. Maya exhaled. It was quiet and controlled, and she turned it into checking a monitor reading so nobody saw it for what it was, which was the specific relief that comes from caring whether someone lives or dies and finding out they did. She pulled off her gloves in the corridor outside the OR and leaned against the wall for a moment, not sliding down it, just leaning, taking 30 seconds to let her body know the acute phase was over. The lower back that had been complaining since morning was now registering a full protest. She ignored it. Marsh was in the corridor. She wasn't surprised. She'd half expected him somewhere in the building, the way you expect certain things when you've gotten a read on how someone moves through the world. "Finch?" he said. "Out of surgery. Stable." She looked at him. "You know her?" "She was part of the escort detail. Yeah." He nodded once, the kind of nod that carries things it doesn't say out loud. "She's going to have a recovery, but she's through the worst of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Falk's people finished with the scanner. "The documents you photographed, the coordinates and the routing information, they've been corroborated against communication intercepts from the last 4 months." He paused. "It's bigger than Hale. The compliance officer, Greer, he's not a hospital administrator." "I know. I saw it when he looked at my hand. He's part of the network. He was placed in the compliance office 8 weeks ago under a fabricated contractor credential." She processed that. "He was there to manage exactly this. If evidence appeared, contain it internally. And neutralize whoever found it." Marsh's voice was even. "The compliance review this morning wasn't Hale panicking. It was a protocol. They had a contingency in place." The corridor felt quieter than it should have been, given that the hospital was still running at elevated capacity 12 hours into the day from hell. "How many people are we talking about?" Falk's count right now is 4 confirmed, 3 probable. Hale, Greer, 2 external operatives, and 3 hospital staff who may have been used without full awareness of what they were participating in. He looked at her. "Cray is in one of those last 3. They're still determining." She thought about Cray's face in the recovery room. The careful non-eye contact, the door-guarding posture of someone who'd been given a role and was following instructions without being told everything. "She didn't know," Maya said. "Not the full scope." "That's the current read, yeah." She pushed off the wall. "The debrief is still happening?" 0400 hours. Secure location, not the hospital. Mercer and Voss will be there, Falk's team, and 2 people from the Department of Justice who arrived on a flight 2 hours ago. "DOJ," she said. "This crossed into federal criminal territory when they identified the courier intercept. The intelligence side hands off to prosecution at a certain point." He paused. "They're going to ask about your operational history, the full picture. You said that before. I'm saying it again because this time it's going to be on record. It's going to be in a DOJ file. Your name, your call sign, the operational parameters." He looked at her carefully. "The quiet life you were trying to build was already gone when the Admiral said my call sign in the ER last night," she said. "Not bitterly, just factually." "I know that." He didn't argue with it. "There's something else." She waited. "The attack on the transport detail today. The one that brought in the 6 casualties. The route information that was used." He stopped. "It came from Greer. He transmitted it after Hale was detained. It was a contingency. If the primary operative was removed, trigger the secondary action." His jaw had tightened. "Finch and her detail were the collateral. They were meant to create enough chaos in the hospital that any evidence you'd gathered would be lost in the response." The weight of that settled on her slowly, the way some things take a moment to arrive at their full size. She'd been in the OR for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The people who'd put Hale in motion, who'd placed Greer in the compliance office, who'd been running this network through a military hospital for at minimum 4 months. They'd known she was gathering evidence, and they'd triggered a mass casualty event to stop her. 6 people had come through those trauma doors. Sergeant Finch had almost died. "Tell Falk," she said. Her voice was steady. The steadiness she'd had all night, all morning, all afternoon. It wasn't calm. She was clear-eyed about that. It was the thing that came instead of panic when you'd trained long enough and had enough stakes in the outcome to keep your head in front of your hands. Tell him everything Greer transmitted needs to be traced. If there's a secondary action still in play, already on it, Marsh said. But that's not what I wanted to tell you. She looked at him. The 3rd person they've confirmed. He held her gaze. The one who flagged your presence in the annex to Greer within 4 minutes of Hale seeing you in the corridor. He paused. It was Delgado. She stared at him. Carlos Delgado, security officer. The man who'd tried to stop her from crossing the ER to Ranger the night before. The man she'd moved past with a look because she'd read him as minor obstruction, as institutional friction, as the specific particular brand of small authority figure that every large institution seemed to generate naturally. He'd been watching her for longer than last night. "Where is he now?" she said. Marsh opened his mouth. Down the corridor, the fire alarm started screaming. The alarm was the pull station kind, manual activation, not a smoke sensor trigger, which meant someone had pulled it deliberately. Maya knew the difference by the pattern of the strobe. Smoke triggers cycled with a slight delay between flashes. Pull station activation was continuous. She'd learned that in a building safety briefing 14 months ago and filed it away the way she filed everything, in the part of her brain that treated information as potential equipment. "That's not a fire," she said. "No," Marsh agreed. He was already moving, one hand on his phone. The corridor filled fast. The standard evacuation response, doors opening, staff appearing with the slightly dazed quality of people whose routines had been interrupted by a sound that required a specific physical response. Maya moved against the flow, toward the nearest stairwell, because if Delgado had pulled that alarm, he'd done it for a reason, and the reason was almost certainly to create the kind of movement and confusion that let someone go somewhere, or do something, or take something without being seen. She grabbed Toby's arm as he came through the trauma unit door. "Ranger's recovery room. Who's with him?" "Nobody, I think. We were all—" She was already moving. The stairwell door hit the wall when she pushed through it. 2 flights down, footsteps echoing, hers and Marsh's behind her, and she could hear him on his phone, clipped words she didn't process because she was focused on the sound below her. There was another set of footsteps, moving faster than the standard evacuation pace. Moving down, not out. The ground floor. She hit the door and came out into the sub-basement corridor 20 feet from the converted storage room where Ranger was recovering. The door was open. She'd left it closed. She came through fast and found Delgado standing 3 feet inside the room with Ranger's monitoring leads in one hand. Not holding them, she registered, pulling them. The monitor was alarming. Ranger was on his feet, which he absolutely should not have been, the surgical site still raw, the chest drain taped to his side, and he was standing because Delgado was standing over him, and Ranger's body had made the ancient animal calculation that whatever this was, lying down was the wrong answer. Delgado turned when she came through the door. I was holding the leads. In his other hand, not a weapon, she clocked that immediately, not a firearm, a phone. Pointed at Ranger, taking a photo or a video, she couldn't tell which. And in the half-second she spent reading the room, she understood. He wasn't here to hurt the dog. He was here to confirm something. The room number, the recovery status, the specific location of the military working dog that the SEAL team had come in with, which was the kind of tactical information that a network trying to track an operation would want to have confirmed by a human set of eyes. Ranger made a sound. Low. Not quite a growl. Something more warning than that. The sound of an animal that has assessed and decided and is communicating the decision. "Carlos," Maya said. Delgado's eyes went to her face. In them, she saw the specific expression of someone who has been caught in a context they can't explain and is processing the geometry of it. Exits, distance, what she knew, what she could prove. "I was checking on the animal," he said. "You pulled the alarm." "I smelled smoke. Put the phone down." He didn't move. Marsh came through the door behind her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 210 pounds of Navy SEAL appearing in a doorway had its own communicative value, and Delgado's eyes moved to him and then back to Maya, and the calculation in his face shifted. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's not a hospital HR option," Maya said. "That's a federal arrest option. You should probably think about which one you want." He looked at the phone in his hand. She saw him consider briefly, doing something with it. She didn't know what, deleting something maybe, or sending something. And in that same moment, Marsh crossed the room in 3 steps and took it from him with the calm efficiency of someone for whom object removal was a practiced skill. Ranger sat down. Not collapsed, sat, with deliberate intention, as though he'd made his point and was now prepared to observe. Delgado was in federal custody within 11 minutes, handed off to two of Voss's MPs in the parking structure in a process that was quiet and fast. Maya stayed with Ranger while it happened, reattaching his monitoring leads, checking the surgical sites. Nothing had torn, which was more luck than management, given that he'd been standing on a surgical repair less than 6 hours old and talking to him in the low, practical voice she'd used the night before. "Sit still," she said. "You're not done yet." Ranger looked at her with the dark-eyed attention of a dog who understood the tone, if not the words, and found it acceptable. Marsh came back at the 15-minute mark. He had 2 cups of coffee, the bad cafeteria kind, which was the only kind available at this point in the day, and he handed her one without asking if she wanted it, which was the correct decision. "Falk got the phone," he said. "Delgado had transmitted 2 photos before you came in. Recovery room location, visible unit insignia on Ranger's vest. To the same network? Same relay. Falk's team is tracking the endpoint." He sat on the upturned crate, the one that had become his default position in this room. The alarm was a dual purpose: create evacuation cover and confirm the dog's location before they lost their window. They thought if Hale was detained and Greer was exposed, the operation would move to extraction, get the dog and the handler out of the facility. Or hit the facility itself. His voice was even saying it, the practiced flatness of someone who'd learned that the way to hold very bad information was to say it the same way you'd say something ordinary. "Voss has the perimeter locked, but this changes the timeline on the debrief." "To when?" "Tonight, 1900 hours. They're not waiting until 0400. He looked at her. "Mercer wants it done before dark." She drank the coffee. It was exactly as bad as expected. "What's the count now? Network members." "Confirmed 6. Hale, Greer, Delgado, 2 external operatives who were picked up in the past hour in separate locations, and a person in the installation's logistics office who'd been providing the initial route data. 6 confirmed, 1 probable still being assessed." He paused. "The probable is a physician, not at this facility." She looked at him. "A consulting cardiologist who did contract work here 3 months ago. He's being interviewed." Marsh wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "It's a wide net." 4 months, she said. "They've been running this for 4 months and nobody—" "The signals were there," he said. "Not defensive, just accurate. They were distributed enough that no single person would see the pattern. That's how these things work. Compartmentalized information moving through a large institution looks like noise until you have a reason to look for the signal." She knew that. She'd known it intellectually, in the abstract way you know things that haven't been personal. Knowing it now, with Hale's reprimand still in her personnel file and Sergeant Finch in post-operative recovery, and Ranger sitting next to her with surgical staples in his chest wall, felt different from knowing it abstractly. "I want the reprimand removed," she said. "Not amended. Removed. Mercer's already told administration. I want it in writing from the hospital, not from the Navy." Marsh looked at her steadily. "You're going to get it. I want Finch's recovery flagged as a direct consequence of the network's actions for the DOJ file. Already documented. And I want—" She stopped, looked at her coffee. "That's all." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing." "No," she said. "It's not." The debrief happened in a conference facility 8 blocks from the hospital, a building she hadn't known existed, which was probably intentional, the kind of location chosen because it had no obvious connection to anyone involved, and a parking structure that allowed vehicles to enter and leave without being visible from the street. Mercer was there. Voss. Falk and 2 members of his team, one of whom she now knew was genuinely intelligence community, and one of whom she was less sure about. The 2 DOJ representatives, a prosecutor named Liang and an investigator named Beckett, who wore her hair in a braid and asked questions the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, with clear awareness of what she was cutting through. Maya had been in rooms like this before. Different furniture, different people, same quality of air. The specific atmosphere of a room where people have gathered to formally account for something that has already happened and cannot be undone. She told it from the beginning. Not her beginning, the story's beginning, the point at which she could establish her involvement without requiring classified prior history details. Beckett let her go for 12 minutes, uninterrupted, and then started with questions that were specific and sequential and left no room for approximation. "What exactly did you observe when you entered the annex? What was the physical condition of the 3rd file?" Describe the placement of the documents within the file. What metadata did the scanner capture? What did Hale say in the radiology corridor, word for word? She answered all of it. Precisely, without embellishment, without minimizing. She'd given statements before in other contexts where accuracy was the only thing that mattered, and she treated this the same way. 40 minutes in, Beckett set down her pen. I want to ask about your prior background, your operational history. What specifically? The Admiral has indicated you served in a classified capacity prior to your current nursing role. We need that on record for the chain of credibility, establishing your ability to correctly identify what you found in the annex. Mercer, across the table, gave her a look that was not quite an apology and not quite reassurance, something in between. He told her this was coming. She'd said she understood. Understanding it and sitting in the room while a DOJ investigator asked her to open the part of her history she'd spent 3 years closing were different experiences. I served as a combat medic attached to a classified special operations support unit for 4 years, she said. The nature of the operations I was attached to is under a security classification I don't have the authority to declassify. I can confirm the service record exists and that Admiral Mercer and Colonel Voss have reviewed it. During that service, did you develop skills that are relevant to what you identified in the annex? Yes. I'm trained in document assessment in operational contexts. I know the difference between a clinical record and a non-clinical insert. I know what operational coordinates look like. I know what a courier document routing chain looks like. She held Beckett's gaze. I've handled classified materials in field conditions. What I found in that file wasn't ambiguous. Beckett wrote something. In your assessment, how long had the documents been in that file? Based on the paper quality and the fold creases, recently printed and recently placed. Within a week, probably less. Consistent with the timing of the 6-day window your signals analysis established, Liang said, to Falk, who nodded. They went another hour. By the end of it, Maya's back was a serious problem, and the coffee she'd been given at the start had gone cold 40 minutes in and she'd drunk it anyway. When Beckett finally closed her notebook, the room had the settled quality of a thing done, not finished because the legal process had its own long timeline that would stretch for months, but the acute phase complete. Nurse Whitmore, Mercer said. He looked tired. Not defeated tired. The functional tired of someone who'd been running on strategy and caffeine for 36 hours and was starting to feel the edges of it. I want to say something on the record before we close this session. She waited. The reprimand issued to you 2 weeks ago was the direct result of a deliberate action taken by Dr. Hale to neutralize a potential witness before an investigation could begin. It had no legitimate clinical basis. The incident on which it was based, the misrouted consult, was a systemic failure that he engineered and then attributed to you. He looked at her steadily. That will be in the DOJ filing. It will be in the hospital's internal review. And it will be formally expunged from your personnel record by written order from the hospital board, which I have been informed will be meeting tomorrow morning for that specific purpose. She looked at him. I should have found you earlier, he said. It wasn't quite an apology. She didn't think he was the kind of man who did formal apologies, and she wasn't the kind of person who needed them. It was something more direct than that, an acknowledgement that time had passed, and things had happened in that time that shouldn't have. I wasn't easy to find, she said. No, you weren't. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. You're very good at disappearing into ordinary. I had practice. The room began to clear. People gathered their files, their laptops, the infrastructure of a formal proceeding folding itself back up. Voss stopped beside Maya on the way out and said simply, "Good work," in the tone of someone who reserves that phrase for specific occasions and meant it. Falk, passing, said nothing, just a nod. She'd take it. Oh. She got back to the hospital at 9:47 p.m. and went directly to the recovery area because there was nowhere else she wanted to be first. Marsh was there. Of course he was. He had a blanket over his lap. Someone had apparently made him sit in an actual chair rather than on the crate. And he was asleep, or close to it, his head tipped back against the wall. Ranger was next to him on the mat, also asleep, his chest rising and falling with the deep regularity of an animal that has decided the crisis is over and has committed fully to rest. Maya stood in the doorway for a moment. The monitoring unit beeped softly. The corridor behind her was quiet. The hospital had calmed back to its overnight rhythm. The mass casualty response absorbed and processed and moved into the managed phase of follow-up care. She checked Ranger's vitals on the monitor without waking either of them. Numbers were good. Better than good. She checked his surgical sites from a distance. No visible signs of discharge. No fever in his posture. The drain still properly placed. He'd need at least 10 more days of strict rest and another 2 weeks of limited activity after that, and she was going to write all of that down in a care document whether anyone had asked her to or not. She was turning to leave when Marcia's voice came, quiet and not quite awake. "How'd it go?" "Done," she said. "All of it?" "The statement part. The rest takes time." He opened his eyes fully. They had the specific, unfocused quality of someone pulling back from genuine sleep, which told her he'd needed it and probably hadn't let himself have it until the debrief was confirmed over. "Liang and Beckett?" "Thorough." "Beckett's good," he said. "She did a case 2 years ago, maritime intelligence breach. Took 12 people down." "I believe it." He looked at Ranger, at the steady rise and fall. Something in his face, in the quiet of the room, was different from how he'd been all day. Less tactical, less managed. Just a man sitting next to his dog in the middle of the night, feeling the specific relief of something that had almost gone very differently, going the way it went instead. "Torres asked about you," he said. "How's his arm?" "Better. He's been given strict instructions to stop undoing the dressing to check the stitches, which he's been following approximately 40% of the time." A pause. "Declan's orbital fracture got properly imaged. They're saying he doesn't need surgery, which he is treating as full medical clearance to do whatever he wants, which is incorrect. But we've been managing that particular interpretation all day." "The kid is going to be a problem," she said. "He's 23. He's already a problem. We're just hoping to direct it usefully." Marsh looked at her. "You should sleep." "I know. Not the sitting on a crate next to the dog kind. The actual kind. I have an on-call room." "With a real bed?" "Technically." "Go." He said it without authority. Not an order, just the simple push of one person telling another person an obvious truth. "I'll be here." "He'll be here." A nod toward Ranger. "The building's not going to fall apart for the 8 hours you're not watching it." She looked at the dog, at the monitor numbers, at Marcia's face, which had the particular tired but steady quality of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be and had made their peace with that. "Call me if anything changes," she said. "You know I will." She left. She slept for 6 hours, which was more than 3 and less than 8, and exactly what her body would permit. She woke at 4:19 a.m., her internal clock still calibrated to operational rhythms she'd never fully shed, and lay still for 4 minutes before accepting she was done sleeping. By 5:30, she was at the nurse's station with the first decent coffee she'd had in 20 hours, working through the overnight reports. Sergeant Finch had moved from the ICU to a monitored surgical ward bed. Good. The head wound patient had been imaged and cleared of intracranial bleed. Very good. The neck shrapnel patient was talking in full sentences and had asked 3 times when he could have real food, which she noted as an excellent prognostic indicator. The torso wounds in bays 3 and 4 were both stable. Toby appeared at 5:45 with the particular look of someone who had also slept badly and was making peace with that. "Dr. Ford signed off on the overnight reports," he said. "He asked me to tell you," a pause like he was choosing words carefully, "that the mass casualty response yesterday was the best coordinated trauma reception he'd ever been part of." She looked at her coffee. "Ford's been in 3 mass casualty responses." "I know, but he still said it." She nodded. "Let that be enough." At 6:10, her phone buzzed. A message from a number she recognized as the hospital administrator's direct line, a man named Gareth, who she'd met once and who had the look of someone perpetually managing a situation he hadn't anticipated. "Board meeting convening 0700. Your presence requested." She stared at that for a moment, then typed back, "I'll be there." The boardroom was on the 4th floor and had a view of the harbor that she'd never seen before because she'd never had occasion to be in it. There were 12 people around the table, board members, she assumed, with Mercer and Voss at one end representing the federal and military interest, and a lawyer she didn't recognize at the other end with a stack of printed documents. Gareth, the administrator, was at the head. Judith Cray was present, in the seat that had the specific quality of the chair you sit in when you're present, but not directing things. Maya sat where they indicated, which was near the center of the table on the window side. She hadn't worn anything different, same scrubs she'd changed into after the debrief, same worn-in shoes. She hadn't thought to change. She noticed a couple of board members clock it and look back at their papers, and she made a note of which ones and then let it go. Gareth opened the meeting with the formal language that administrators use when legal consequences are proximate. The investigation findings, the determination regarding the reprimand, the associated personnel file corrections, the lawyer-distributed papers. One set to Maya, the formal written order signed by the board, expunging the reprimand and associated administrative restriction from her personnel record. Effective immediately. She read it twice. It said exactly what Mercer had told her it would say, which didn't make holding it in her hands feel less significant. The board also wants to address the conduct of Dr. Hale prior to his detainment, Gareth continued, and the structural failures in the compliance process that allowed a false report to proceed without adequate review. That took 40 minutes. Maya didn't speak for most of it. She answered questions when asked. The board members' questions were less sharp than Beckett's, but more numerous. The questions of people processing institutional accountability in real time. She answered them the same way she'd answered everything for the past 36 hours, accurately, without embellishment. Near the end, one of the board members, an older woman with reading glasses on a chain who had been taking handwritten notes throughout, looked up and said directly, "Nurse Whitmore, what do you need from this institution to continue working here?" The room was quiet. Maya looked at her. "The reprimand removed, which is done." She paused. "A formal review of the documentation protocols that allowed a misrouted consult to be attributed to the nursing staff rather than the routing system. That's a system failure, not a personnel failure, and it needs to be fixed." Another pause. "And a written acknowledgement that the trauma unit functions best when the clinical judgment of experienced nursing staff is incorporated into the escalation process rather than filtered through attending hierarchy." The woman wrote all three down. "Is that it?" "For now," Maya said. "Look." She left the board meeting at 9:20 a.m. and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the harbor view through the corridor window she passed on the way to the elevator. The water was gray and flat and looked like what she felt, not particularly dramatic, just present. Done. Her phone was ringing. She looked at the screen. Torres. "Whitmore," she answered. "We're being moved." His voice was direct. "Transfer back to the installation this afternoon. Ranger included, if he's cleared for transport." She calculated quickly. "He can be moved. Short distance, lying lateral. He needs to be on a surface-padded platform and no bumps if you can manage it." "We'll manage it." A pause. "I wanted to call before we left. Me and Declan both. Tell Declan to ice the eye and not do anything stupid. He's 23. I know. Tell him anyway." A pause. She could hear voices in the background, the particular ambient sound of a group of people who know each other well in a temporary space. "Whitmore, what you did. The whole of it, not just the medical part. You understand what you put yourself in the middle of." "I was already in the middle of it." "Yeah." He sounded like he wanted to say more and was editing it down. "Some people did that." She recognized the compression. "Thank you. From all of us." She looked at the harbor. "Get Ranger home safe." She hung up, put the phone in her pocket, stood there another moment. Then the elevator opened and Judith Cray stepped out. They looked at each other. Cray had the precise, managed bearing she always had, but something underneath it was different. Not broken, exactly, but load-bearing. The expression of someone who'd been through a formal process and come out the other side having been assessed and not destroyed, and who was now figuring out what that meant. "The compliance review determined I wasn't aware of the full scope," Cray said. Her voice was even. "I know. I was used." She said it like she was testing the weight of the words. "The routing system failure 2 weeks ago. Greer flagged it to me as a personnel matter before I could assess it as a system matter. He directed the process." "I know that too." Cray was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if that's an excuse." "It's not an excuse," Maya said. "It's an explanation. Those are different things." She held Cray's gaze. "You can do something with an explanation. You can change the system that let it happen. You can make sure the next time someone flags a consult misroute, it gets investigated as a system failure before anyone's personnel file is touched. Cray looked at her. Something in her face shifted. Small, controlled, but genuine. Yes, she said. I can do that. The elevator behind her dinged again. Admiral Mercer stepped out. He saw them both. Read the room in the way Maya had noticed he always read rooms. Fast, comprehensive, filing what he saw. He nodded to Cray, who moved past him toward the boardroom. Then he came to stand beside Maya at the window. They looked at the harbor together for a moment. Ranger's being transported this afternoon, she said. I know. Marsh will stay with him until they clear the installation's veterinary facility. He needs 10 days of strict rest. I've communicated that. Marsh is treating it as a direct order. To the dog? Mostly to himself, Mercer said. He tends to project his own recovery timeline onto Ranger. We manage it. She almost smiled. The second time in 2 days. At this rate, it might become a habit. I want to talk to you about something, Mercer said. His voice had changed. The formal meeting quality was gone, replaced with something more direct. The voice he used, she was starting to understand when he was about to say something he'd already decided on, but wanted to present as a conversation. All right, she said. Not now. Give it a week. Let the legal process get moving. Let the hospital stabilize. He looked at the water. But I want to talk to you about what comes next. She looked at him sideways. What does come next? He didn't answer immediately. Let the window do its work for a moment. The gray harbor, the early morning light that was finally starting to look like it had some intention. Then, there's a gap, he said, between what military medical installations are equipped to handle and what they need to be able to handle. In mass casualty response, in trauma training, in the specific kind of knowledge that comes from operating in high-stakes conditions without institutional backup. She was listening. You have that knowledge, he said, and you've spent 11 months watching a major military medical facility fail to access it. That's a careful way to describe being ignored. Yes, it is. He turned to look at her fully. I want you to know that the position I have in mind is not charity. It's not a consolation prize. It's something this institution actually needs and demonstrably cannot fill without someone who's done what you've done. He paused. I wanted to say that before anything else, so it's on the record. She turned to look at him too, the man who had walked into her emergency room at 2:30 in the morning and set her call sign like a key turning in a lock she'd thought was permanently closed. You said give it a week, she said. At least. Then let's give it a week. He nodded, turned back to the window. The board has a formal session tomorrow. Hale's attending privileges are being permanently revoked. The hospital will be issuing a public statement about the investigation, coordinated with the DOJ timeline. What does the statement say about the staff involved? It acknowledges systemic failures in the review process and the administrative action taken against nursing staff as a result of those failures. He looked at her. It doesn't name you specifically, unless you want it to. She thought about that, about her name on a public statement, attached to a federal investigation and a personnel dispute, and a story that was going to be told in institutional terms that would flatten and compress everything that had actually happened into something that fit in a press release. No, she said, not yet. Understood. He moved toward the elevator, put his hand on the button. Then, without turning, you did well. All of it. The annex, the trauma response, the debrief. A pause. The ER at 2:13 in the morning when you didn't have to come back. She looked at the harbor. I know, she said. Not modesty. Not performance. Just the acknowledgement of a person who had done a thing and was done explaining why. The elevator opened. Mercer stepped in. The doors closed. Maya stayed at the window for another minute. The harbor was the same gray it had been when she got there. Persistent Caldwell weather. She watched a cargo vessel moving slowly across the far edge of the frame, one of the big ones, low in the water, working. She thought about Sergeant Finch in her surgical ward bed, about Ranger's monitor numbers at 4:19 in the morning, steady and good. About Toby, who had handed her a decompression kit in the middle of the night when nobody told him to, because he'd looked at the situation and made a decision. She thought about the scanner in her pocket. It was back with Falk's team, Had been since yesterday morning. It's job done. About the documents photographed in the misfiled third folder. About the way Hale had looked at her hands in the radiology corridor, and what he'd seen in them, and what he'd done with what he saw. She thought about the reprimand, the formal written order that had expunged it sitting in her bag downstairs. She thought about the 18 hours it had taken him to file it, and the calculation behind those 18 hours, and the particular arrogance of a person who looked at someone quiet and competent and saw only a convenient surface for the blame they needed to deposit somewhere. She'd thought, the night Mercer said her call sign, that a door she'd thought was closed was turning out to have been waiting. What she hadn't anticipated, couldn't have, going into it, was that the thing behind the door wasn't a return to what she'd been before. It wasn't the operational years, the classified missions, the particular identity of a person defined by what they could do in conditions where the stakes were life and death, and the margin for error was zero. What was behind the door was this: a hospital that had failed its patients and its staff through arrogance and neglect, now beginning the slow work of reckoning with that failure. A trauma unit that needed someone who understood both the clinical and the institutional terrain. A SEAL team whose dog was going home because she'd knelt on the floor in the middle of the night and paid attention. And something else. Something she hadn't put words to yet, that she was still holding at a distance, examining. The feeling that the ordinary life she'd been building wasn't something she'd lost. It was something that had just become larger than she'd originally planned. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. No name. Sent at 5:48 a.m., which was before the board meeting, before the corridor conversation with Cray, before all of it. Sitting in her notifications unread while the morning moved around it. It said, "The investigation missed one." And below that, a photograph. She enlarged it with 2 fingers. It was a photo of a person. Taken from a distance, slightly blurred, the kind of image captured on a phone through a window or across a parking lot. Not professional surveillance, but deliberate. The person in the image was walking, business casual, carrying a laptop bag, moving with the specific purposeful stride of someone going somewhere they needed to be. She stared at the image for a long time. Then she looked up from her phone, past the harbor window and the gray water and the slow-moving vessel, at the street below, and saw the same person, walking in real time, 12 stories down. She called Mercer before the elevator doors had time to close. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear the elevator's mechanical hum still in the background. He hadn't gone far. 12 stories down, she said. East side of the building, moving toward the main entrance. Gray jacket, laptop bag, brown leather. I'm sending you the photo now. A pause. Where did you get this image? Unknown number, sent at 0548 this morning. She was already moving toward the stairwell. Elevator was too slow, too contained. The message said the investigation missed one. Hold your position, Mercer said. I'm not going to hold my position. Whitmore, I'm not going to hold my position, she said again, not arguing, just stating. But I'll stay on the phone. She hit the stairwell door. The sound changed, concrete and echo, her footsteps loud in the shaft. She took the stairs at a controlled pace, not running, because running down 12 flights was how you arrived winded and off balance, and she needed to arrive neither of those things. Mercer was already giving instructions to someone on another line. She could hear it, the low parallel conversation, clipped and fast. Physical description confirmed, he said back to her. We have a name. Dr. Elliot Strand, consulting physician, contract basis. He had a 2-month engagement with Harbor Ridge's clinical informatics review 6 weeks ago. The probable, she said, the one Falk said was still being assessed. They cleared him yesterday. His access logs were clean. Someone cleaned them. She hit the 8th floor landing. He knew about the signals analysis. He knew what Falk's team was looking for. We're moving on him now. 2 minutes. I'll be there in 90 seconds. Maya. His voice changed. Just slightly. Just enough. Using her name instead of her rank or her last name. Don't engage him directly. She understood what he was asking. She also understood that 2 minutes was a long time if Strand reached the parking structure and had a vehicle positioned. I'll be visible, she said. That's all. She didn't wait for his response to that. She came out of the stairwell into the main lobby at a walk. Controlled, deliberate, the walk of someone with somewhere to be, rather than someone following someone. The lobby was mid-morning busy. Staff crossing in multiple directions, A family at the information desk, two orderlies with a wheelchair. Normal hospital morning, the kind that had been normal for 11 months before last night, reorganized everything. She saw Strand immediately. He was standing near the revolving door, not moving. His phone was out. He was reading something on it, and whatever he was reading had changed his posture. The purposeful stride she'd seen from 12 stories up was gone. He was very still in the way people get still when they receive information that requires immediate recalculation. He'd seen something. Falk's team moving, maybe. A text from a network contact who'd noticed the perimeter tightening. Something that told him the 2 minutes he'd had were now fewer. He looked up from his phone. His eyes found her immediately, which told her he knew what she looked like, which meant he'd been watching this situation for longer than she'd been aware of him. The eye contact lasted less than a second. His gaze moved away, calculated, controlled. But that second was enough. She saw the recognition in it. The specific expression of a person who has just understood that the room they're standing in has closed around them. She didn't move toward him. She stood where she was, near the base of the stairwell, in the middle of the lobby, in plain sight of 20 people going about their morning. She just looked at him with the same flat, deliberate attention she'd used in the compliance office and the debrief and the annex and every other moment in the past 36 hours when someone had tried to make her feel like she was the problem. Strand put his phone in his pocket, straightened, made a decision. She could see it happen, the brief internal negotiation concluding. He turned toward the revolving door. Voss's MP stepped through it from the outside at the same moment. Behind her, a second MP coming through the side entrance. And from the elevator bank, Falk himself. Not running, not dramatic, just arriving with the unhurried certainty of someone who'd done the geometry ahead of time. Strand stopped. He was in the middle of the lobby with exit routes that had become non-exits without anyone making a scene or raising a voice. The staff around them continued moving. The family at the information desk continued their conversation. Nobody in the lobby understood what they were watching except the people it concerned. He turned back toward Maya. She was the only person he'd made eye contact with. She was the only fixed point in the room that wasn't law enforcement. She thought he might say something. He looked like a man who'd spent his professional life being the one who managed situations with words, with institutional authority, with the kind of credentialed confidence that made other people defer. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, quietly, just to him. He closed it. Falk reached him. The MP from the front entrance came alongside. The conversation that followed was brisk and quiet and over in under 2 minutes. The kind of detainment that happened so smoothly that most of the people in the lobby never registered it as a detainment at all. Maya watched it happen. Then she turned, walked back to the elevator, and pressed the button for the 4th floor, where she had a cup of coffee sitting cold on the boardroom table that she intended to throw away and replace with a better one. Elliot Strand's full operational role took 4 days to establish, and Maya learned it in pieces rather than all at once, the way these things tended to emerge from a federal investigation. Incrementally, each piece shifting the shape of the ones before it. He had not been a peripheral figure. He'd been the architect. The person who'd identified Harbor Ridge as a viable access point 8 months ago had spent 2 months there under the informatics consulting contract building relationships and mapping the system, and had then recruited Hale, not the other way around. Hale's arrogance had made him easy to approach. A man who believed himself undervalued was a man with a grievance someone else could use. Strand had used it with precision, offering Hale a combination of money and the specific satisfaction of feeling like the most informed person in the room, which for Hale had probably been as motivating as the financial component. Greer had been Strand's placement. Delgado had been recruited separately, through a different vector, 9 weeks in. The network was clean and compartmentalized, each piece knowing only what it needed to know. Strand had been careful. What he hadn't been careful enough about was the physical records. He'd used the annex himself during his informatics engagement, had established the pattern of physical document handling as a workaround to the digital signals monitoring he'd anticipated. What he hadn't anticipated was that the person who would eventually walk into that annex looking for evidence was someone who'd processed classified materials and field conditions and could identify a non-clinical insert in a medical file in under 30 seconds. He'd built his network around the assumption that Harbor Ridge's staff were exactly what they appeared to be. He'd been wrong about one of them. The DOJ press statement went out on a Thursday morning, 10 days after Ranger came through the ER doors. Maya read it on her phone in the break room between a patient handoff and a team briefing, standing at the counter with her coffee, which was finally a decent cup because Toby had found a way to get the good beans restocked. The statement named Strand, Hale, Greer, Delgado, and the two external operatives. It described the scope of the intelligence breach, the 4 months of compromised operational data, the connection to the attacks on military personnel in the Caldwell area. It described the role of Harbor Ridge Military Medical Center in the investigation, and the cooperation of hospital staff in providing material evidence. It didn't name her. She'd asked for that specifically, and they'd respected it. What it did say, in the final paragraph, was that the investigation had been materially advanced by the actions of a hospital staff member whose prior service and clinical expertise had proven decisive in identifying physical evidence that signals analysis alone had been unable to establish. The language was bureaucratic and correct, and told the story without telling the story, which was precisely what she'd wanted. She put her phone in her pocket and went to the team briefing. The hospital board met on the following Monday and issued its own public statement, separate from the DOJ filing, addressed to the institution's staff and the community it served. It acknowledged the false reprimand. It acknowledged the systemic failure in the documentation review process. It acknowledged that nursing staff had been used as administrative cover for attending physician conduct issues, and committed to a formal structural review of escalation protocols. The statement was read aloud at the all-staff meeting by Gareth, who did it with the practiced calm of an administrator who'd learned in the past 10 days that he had a larger mess to manage than he'd originally understood, and who was approaching it with the diligence of someone trying very hard to do right by a situation that had already done enough wrong. Maya sat in the third row, next to Toby, who had brought a notepad and was writing things down, which she thought was a good sign about his future in this profession. On her other side, Erica from the trauma unit, who had not said much about any of it, but who had shown up early to every shift for the past 10 days, and who Maya had started to understand was the kind of nurse who responded to institutional crisis by becoming more thorough, not less. When Gareth finished reading, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Erica said, under her breath, "About time." Maya didn't respond, but she thought, yes, exactly that. About time. She saw Marsh one more time before the SEAL team's formal departure from the Caldwell area. He came to the hospital on a Wednesday afternoon, not in tactical gear, just jeans and a gray pullover, looking like a person rather than an operator, which was a distinction she understood better than most. He found her in the trauma unit, where she was going over the new escalation protocol documentation with a group of 4 nurses and a resident who had the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone encountering genuinely useful procedural reform for the first time. She excused herself. They stood in the corridor outside the unit, which had become, she realized, something of a recurring venue for significant conversations. Ranger cleared the installation vet's assessment this morning, he said. All surgical sites clean. They're talking about a full return-to-duty timeline of 8 to 10 weeks, which is faster than expected. He's stubborn, she said. Extremely. Something in his expression. The quiet satisfaction of a man whose most important thing had come back. We're moving out day after tomorrow. I know. He looked at her for a moment with the careful, direct attention she'd gotten used to from him. The kind that didn't require performance on either side. How are you doing, actually? She considered the question. She'd gotten better in the past 10 days at not deflecting it automatically. Tired, she said, still processing. There are parts of the last 2 weeks that I'll probably be thinking about for a while. Yeah. He nodded. That's how it works. The Finch situation. She paused. Knowing that the mass casualty response was triggered deliberately, as a contingency against the evidence I'd gathered. I'll be working through that one for a while. She's going to be okay, he said. I talked to her yesterday. She's already arguing with her physical therapist, which her husband says is a good sign. It is. She looked at her hands, at the scar on her left forearm, the one that had started this whole thing when Mercer had recognized it from across an emergency room in the middle of the night. How's Torres? Arms healed cleaner than expected. He's annoyed about it because he was using the injury as justification for being cantankerous, and now he doesn't have it. A pause. Declan wants me to tell you he followed the doctor's instructions about the eye. Mostly. He lasted 9 days. That's a record for him. She almost smiled. The full version this time, not the contained almost smile she'd been rationing, but the actual thing. Tell him well done. Marsh reached into the pocket of his pullover and brought out something small. He held it out to her. A coin, military challenge coin, the kind that units minted for specific operations or milestones. She took it. It was heavier than it looked. On one side, a unit insignia she didn't recognize but could read the elements of. On the other, an engraved date and a single word, Ranger. From the team, he said. Not a formal thing, just from us. She looked at the coin in her palm. At the date, last week, the day the vet had cleared Ranger's surgical sites. She thought about what Toby had said that first morning. The best coordinated trauma reception he'd ever been part of. She thought about the family at the information desk who hadn't known what they were watching. She thought about Sergeant Finch arguing with her physical therapist, and Declan lasting 9 days on a medical instruction, and a dog who'd eaten the corner of a surgical drape and looked extremely pleased with himself. Thank you, she said. He nodded, started to turn, then stopped. Mercer's going to reach out about the position. He said give it a week. It's been 10 days. I know. She closed her hand around the coin. Tell him I'm ready to talk. Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then, for the first time in all the hours she'd spent in proximity to him, he smiled. A real one, the kind that changed the whole architecture of a face. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then he put it away. Good, he said, and left. 3 weeks later, Maya Whitmore stood in front of a room of 14 people, trauma nurses, 2 residents, a physician's assistant, and 1 very skeptical attending from the surgical unit who had come, she suspected, because Mercer had made the attendance strongly advisable, and taught the first session of what would become Harbor Ridge's new mass casualty trauma preparedness program. She hadn't written the curriculum on her own. She'd written it with Solis, who had opinions about everything, and most of them turned out to be correct, and with a trauma specialist Mercer had connected her with from the Naval Medical Research Institute, and with Erica, whose input on the nursing-specific protocols was frankly better than anything Maya had drafted herself. She wasn't the program director. That role existed and had a title and a salary attached to it, and Mercer had offered it to her, and she'd asked for 2 weeks to think about it, and then taken it. What she was, standing in front of that room on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee and 14 people looking at her with varying degrees of skepticism and attention, was someone who had stopped managing the distance between who she had been and who she was trying to become. The gap had closed. Not because the operational years were behind her, they were, and they would stay there, but because she'd stopped treating them as something to hide from the ordinary life rather than something that could be woven into it. The work she'd done in classified operational zones hadn't ended when she'd stopped doing it. It lived in her hands, in the way she read a room, in the specific quality of attention she brought to a patient in crisis. It had always been there. She'd just spent 3 years keeping it quiet, and a hospital that had decided she wasn't worth paying attention to had made it easier to stay quiet. What Preston Hale had done, and Strand and Greer and Delgado, and all the structural machinery of institutional dismissal they'd operated through and alongside, was look at a quiet woman with a trauma nurse's badge and decide she was the full picture. They'd seen the surface and stopped there, because looking further would have required them to reckon with the possibility that someone they'd already categorized might contain things their category couldn't hold. People did that. Not always maliciously, sometimes just lazily, sometimes because genuinely seeing another person required effort they hadn't budgeted for, sometimes because it was easier to manage someone you'd underestimated than to recalibrate. She'd let it happen too. She'd been so committed to the ordinary life that she'd made herself smaller than she was inside it, had accepted the reprimand without the fight it deserved, had walked out of the trauma unit without saying half of what she should have said, had spent 11 months being thorough and invisible and telling herself that was enough. It wasn't enough. Not for her, and not for the patients who needed someone in that unit who'd been somewhere past the edge and come back knowing what they'd learned. She looked at the room, at Toby in the second row with his notepad open, at Erica near the wall with her arms crossed, which was how she listened when she was paying close attention, at the skeptical attending who'd brought a coffee and was holding it like a shield. We're going to start with triage, she said, not the textbook version, the version where you have 6 casualties inbound, 1 critical attending, and a blood bank running 2 liters below what you asked for. She set her own coffee down. The version where everything is slightly wrong and you have to make the right decisions anyway. Because that's the version you'll actually encounter, and I want you ready for it. The skeptical attending put his coffee down. The room got quiet in the specific way rooms get quiet when people understand suddenly that what they're about to hear is worth listening to. She had a lot to teach them. She started. Well, on a shelf in the trauma unit's break room, in a spot that had previously held a collection of outdated pharmaceutical catalogs and a coffee mug that no one would claim, there was now a challenge coin. It sat on its edge, propped against the wall, the engraved side facing out. Ranger. The date below it was the day a dog fought his way back. Most of the staff who saw it didn't know the full story. They knew pieces. The overnight SEAL team, the mass casualty event, the investigation, the news coverage that had been careful and incomplete in the way news coverage always was. They knew that something significant had happened and that Maya Whitmore had been in the middle of it. They knew she'd been written up and that it had been reversed, and that she was now running a program that had changed the way the unit prepared for its worst days. What they didn't know, what most people never know about the people they work alongside, was the specific weight of the years that had made her who she was. The classified deployments. The perimeter held for 22 minutes alone. The dog named Colt, who had also lived. The 3 years of building something ordinary around the space where all of that used to be, and the night a door she'd thought was closed turned out to be waiting. What they didn't know was that the woman who taught them how to triage 6 casualties in a compromised unit, who could read a clinical picture in 30 seconds and a human one almost as fast, who documented everything and deflected nothing, and had once pressed a scanner flat against a recovery room wall while a federal operation moved around her. That woman had spent 11 months being told to stay in her lane by people who had never looked at the lane carefully enough to understand what it contained. What they didn't know was that the hardest thing she'd done in those months wasn't the ER at 2:13 a.m., or the annex, or the debrief, or even the lobby where she'd stood still while Strand made his calculation. The hardest thing had been the 6 minutes she'd sat in her car after the reprimand, deciding whether to accept that this was what she was going to be now. She hadn't accepted it. She just needed the 6 minutes to be sure. The people who had tried to erase her had made one mistake. They'd done it to someone who had already survived things erasure couldn't touch. You can write a reprimand into a personnel file, but you can't write out what a person knows. You can reassign someone to a different unit, but you can't reassign their judgment. You can call a quiet woman ordinary and mean it as a dismissal, but ordinary and invisible are not the same thing, and the difference between them is exactly the kind of thing that matters. When the doors burst open at 2:13 in the morning and everybody else freezes, she had not frozen. She never had. The challenge coin sat in the break room and the program ran, and the unit got better at its worst days because someone had decided that being underestimated was information about the person doing the underestimating, not about her. Some lessons cost more than they should. Some people have to fight for the floor that was always theirs. Some stories take the long way around before they arrive at the place they were always going. Maya Whitmore had taken the long way. She was exactly where she was supposed to be.